Okay, well, I do not have any special visuals for you today other than myself, which is probably a scary visual, but do have some interesting stuff here to share from Genesis chapter 15 and Genesis chapter 16. Going to really focus on a couple of areas of interpretation, one which is very important to the doctrine of imputation, which is what we see in Genesis chapter 15, verse 6, when Abraham believed in the Lord and it was counted on him for righteousness. But before we go there, there's a little translation issue for verse 1, depending on what you're reading. If you're reading the King James, it says, I am thy shield and thy exceedingly great reward, indicating that God is his reward, which, although that's a true statement, he is our reward in many ways. But the NASB, the ESV, and I think the NIV all translate this, your reward shall be very great. And so, how do we know which one is correct? I always go to the context when there can be two different kinds of flavors to an interpretation. What fits the context? Well, when we look at the context, the very next verse is Abram saying, Lord, what will you give me since I'm childless? So the whole idea is God giving to Abraham based on the promise of Genesis 12, which is reiterated in Genesis 13 and is now again coming up here in Genesis 15. So I think the idea that Abraham's reward shall be very great is the better translation. Um, and that promise, as I said, began in last week's lesson in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. The opening context section of your guide's got some important information in it that doesn't come up later in the lesson. And I say that because it's based on what's later in chapter 15. But I'm glad they bring it out here because this idea of the ritual of solidifying a contract between two individuals where they would cut up the animal and they would both parties would walk between the parts of the animal. But in chapter 15, verse 17, what we see happening is God putting Abram to sleep. And then God, in the form of a smoking oven and torch, goes through the parts himself. And that is very significant because it's demonstrating that this covenant, this contract, is all on God. It's an unconditional covenant. That Abraham's obedience and in times his disobedience, and more importantly, when you think about it, his future descendants' disobedience, was not going to cause God to forsake them. He is going to fulfill his promise, as we talked a lot about last week. So that is a very significant place in chapter 15. So make sure you go over that. It's right there at the beginning of your curriculum in that context section. And then the curriculum explains the cultural practice that Abram is referring to or referencing in verse 3 when he suggests that Eliezer could be his heir, his servant could be his heir. This was something that they did legitimately do in Abram's day. In the commentary of verse 5 now, going to verse 5 in our text, which is God taking Abram outside and saying, now look towards the heavens and count the stars. In that explanation, all it says is to dispel the idea of Eliezer being Abram's heir. God restated the promise of a numerous offspring and then, of course, told him to go out and look at the stars. However, point out that God does more than that. When you go back to verse 4, he specifically corrects Abram and states that the promised son, the promised heir, would be from his own body or own bowels. This is not going to be a servant. This was not going to be a human solution based on human culture or human tradition, but God was going to perform a miracle. He's going to give him a son from his own body. And then that gets us to verse 6. Abraham believed God and was reckoned or counted to him as righteousness, or the translation that is being used for the material, it is credited to him for righteousness. This statement is so important. It's repeated 4 places in the New Testament in reference to this event, in reference to Abram's Abraham's faith. Romans 4:3, Romans 4:20 and 22, Galatians 3:5 through 9, and James 2:23. You might want to maybe go to the Romans 4 account and kind of read that. It's got quite a bit of context in it, all around the restating of that verse. But this is so important. We better get this right. And unfortunately, the curriculum makes a troubling explanation here that may reflect a false view that is quite a controversy about the doctrine of imputation in the Old Testament, specifically as it applies to Abraham. In the last paragraph of page 124, it states, credited is an accounting term that relates to assigning value or adding to one's account. Now, the crediting being an accounting term is exactly right. That's where we get the doctrine of imputation, to put something to one's account. But here they give it two different possibilities. One is assigning value or adding to one's account or crediting to one's account. And then it goes on to say this: righteousness speaks of behavior that holds to a certain standard. Abraham's belief, or if you want to say behavior of belief, met God's standard, therefore he was in right standing with God. That is not what is happening here. Abraham is not reaching some standard that gives him righteousness. What's happening here is imputation. Abraham's belief in God causes God to take God's righteousness and put it to Abraham's account. You say, well, that's all that they're meaning there. But listen to the explanation of this controversy, where Robert Gundry, a Greek scholar, is presenting what sounds like the same view that the material is kind of leaning towards. Gundry claims that Paul does not here teach. He's now referencing one of the Romans passages about Abraham believing God. Gundry claims that Paul does not here teach the imputation of Christ's righteousness to Abraham or to the believer. Rather, what he teaches is that God counts or reckons one's faith as righteousness. Since Abraham had no works by which he might be justified before God, God counted his faith as righteousness instead. God chose to reckon his faith to be righteousness, and therefore Abraham was righteous before God. So there isn't really any imputation in these verses. And then I have an ellipsis to just cut out some things. And then it says, so it is your own faith that God reckons as righteousness, and there isn't really any imputation of Christ's righteousness to you at all. Folks, that is a terrible doctrine or teaching. God puts to our account his righteousness, and it's no different in the Old Testament. Even though Abraham's on the other side of the cross, God is putting to Abraham's account God's righteousness. It's not saying there that Abraham's faith and obedience is in and of itself righteousness. That righteousness is always put to our account from God. So we need to be careful there. And this question, this was actually kind of brought to my attention by one of the teachers who called me this morning. I hadn't even looked at the material yet. So, you got thinking people out there that are going to pick up on that and maybe be led to the wrong idea. So make sure you get that straight on this, that it is imputation. That is what is being talked about here. One other thing I want to point out involves chapter 16, the mess that Abram and Sarai make by once again trying to help God out. So previously we talked about how God told Abram that specifically, no, it can't be your servant. It's going to be someone from your bowels. So now chapter 16, Sarai comes up with this great idea of how it can still be Abraham's seed. It can still be from Abraham's body that a son comes, but because Sarai is barren, she offers another solution. Once again, one that in the culture was a legitimate way in which you could produce an heir if you are barren, that you could have your handmaid. We see Jacob doing this, the 12 sons of Jacob. Some of them are from Rachel, some of them are from Leah, but some of them are from their mistresses, their handmaidens. So, what's the result? The result, of course, is Ishmael, who's the father of the Arab people, the sworn, many of them at least, most of them, sworn enemies to the Israelites, which Genesis 16:12 predicts they would be. Listen to Genesis 16:12. Speaking of Ishmael, he shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen, meaning the Israelites, because they are kin, right? They're related to Abraham. So that really puts today's situation and the constant battles in Israel into the context right here in our lesson. One other thing, there's a good suggestion on page 128 of the curriculum where they suggest you make 3 columns, one for Abram, one for Sarai, one for Hagar. Read chapter 16, 1 through 6, and list the incorrect attitudes and actions of each person. I'm not going to tell you about my list other than to say this. When you do that, Hagar is going to come out with less incorrect attitudes and actions than any of them, than either Abram or Sarai. So that's a really good visual for kind of where things are at today. And it's a good, in that passage, and it's a good reminder that positional sanctification, which is what we see in Genesis 15, where God imputes to Abram his righteousness, is different than practical sanctification, where we get to chapter 16, we see Abram not doing a good job of working out the practical sanctification because of his sin and his willingness to go with Sarai's suggestion and all of that. So just reminding us that though we are sanctified in Christ, we have a constant battle with sin. We have to constantly be dealing with sin and resisting it and obeying God. So I hope these things help you. Hope you have a great class this week.